give you yet another history of man. Some of the earliest records, whether I'm making this up or not, that sounds right. Earliest records of man make references, as they're translated now, hieroglyphics, drawings, but after the fact, present-day people put a spiritual connotation on it. And some of the first, including the ones that apparently have to do with hunting, killing of animals, people look at it now and they infer. It is analyzed as a fact that it's not just about hunting, that there are other symbols and motifs that show that man was already experiencing or attempting to experience something of a higher nature, and that he was not simply drawing pictures on cave walls of men slaughtering elk. There was something else also involved. Then I was going to suggest that some of the earliest references beyond picturizations had to do with mysteries. Sometimes it is translated in the West, again, as spiritual, and etc. But I have even pointed out this kind of activity, some of the earliest references that you could, just as a casual reader, could attribute or try to align with operations like this kind of activity had to do with what was called mystery schools. And I was going to suggest to you that that is indeed a wonderful name for it, and that was part of the history of man, is a sense of mystery. And I don't mean in just some PBS vague sense of a child looking out the window going, oh, life is a mystery. No, it's much more than that. Consider the history of man in a way that is easy to describe and is not very much dependent upon your acceptance of my idea, because you personally have relived. Every child relives, every sane, genetically sound child relives the history of man in a certain way. And it's not some dream, they simply do. And usually do not recall it in any detail, but I will recall it for you. And it was the history of man in the sense we're discussing it now. There may be more to it that I may know, but for the point that we're making tonight, the kind of view I was trying to give you. Once man, and remember you went through this yourself, so it's not just some vague picture I conjured up out of nowhere to fit some theory I have, since I don't have a theory. Has anybody got an extra theory? That was the humor for the night. Especially if anybody sees it on TV, that is strictly a joke. Do not send me your theories. I am not in need of additional crackpot mail. I mean, theories. The history of man is such that once the intellect gets going, let me go back and present to you as the mass history of humanity right now instead of just you went through it, but it was so brief. And you're already then, you had peers. But let's go back to Ken and Barbie, the first man and woman, and all their little families, or Adam and Eve. As soon as the intellect got cranked up, as soon as it was operating, man had a mystery on his hands. I could describe numerous mysteries, and I could describe it as one that is sometimes attempted by philosophers and people who have no particular active interest in this sort of activity, but they can say, well, the mystery is the mystery of life. What are we here for? But let's be specific. I can give you specifics that have to do with what all of this is about. I can just pick out several out of, I could make them up forever, pull out the examples. But once that intellect got operating, what would have been one of the first things that a man would ask, if you can try to put yourself back in the position that here it is, let's say that humanity has already lived X amount of years here on this planet, looking more or less like we are, and that the intellect, if it makes you feel better, gradually built up to the point that one day it finally sparked, like the old card, turned over, or as all the creation stories always put, that God finally went boom, nice old picture of God reaching down and touching man, or saying, here's the word, and the Hindus and everyone has an idea that finally the gods spoke the word. And simple people take the creation story to be that then they created man. But what the stories were attempting to describe, the genetics of life running through man, was attempting to convey very subtly the message that what it created was man's intellect. It wasn't talking about the creation of man physically, that's not the point. But that the gods had to intervene, that something had to happen, they went, and the intellect started. So take it either immediately or gradually, whatever you can deal with, and think about the fact that the man, Adam and Eve, had an intellect then for a while. A few days, a few weeks. I'm telling you that the first thing they were presented with was a mystery. And what would the mystery have been? Let me present the first one to you with a two-pronged mystery. The first one is, what the hell is this? So you're used to it. But I can assure you, you went through a very brief stage. You can even see it in children. You could see it in a different way now. If I make any sense out of this to you tonight, you could go back now, and if you were at the right time around some relative or someone who has a child at the right age and watch it just as it begins to speak, everyone gets all carried away, and there's a kind of physical, linear progression to it that people do not pay any attention in any extraordinary way. It's just, oh, little Bubba's talking. He's beginning to walk. But there's something else going on. If you can be there when a kid says the first word or so, it usually takes it the same way as walking. He has to stumble around 2 or 3 times and fall down. But if you can be around the kid, you can see the history of man intellectually, because you can see the kid go, blah, 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 and they'll keep working on, is that mama? Mama, mama. And finally he'll say, mama, mama. But he has to get some sort of response. So after 2 or 3 times, 2 or 3 days, if you're there, see, parents normally, everybody else, they get all excited. He finally goes, and he looks right at the mother and goes, mama. And everybody just wets their pants, and they call grandmother, and they have a fit, and they just bounce them around. But if you were sitting there looking now, you could see something else. I'm telling you, something else. If you can look in their eyes, but you can see it. It is almost like the cartoon with a light bulb going on above somebody's head when they had a great idea, except this one is inside the head. And you can see the kid. One day it will happen. They go, mama, dada, or something, and it'll be the combination of that and somebody else with them, like their mother, dad, and go, ah! I'm not saying that one causes the other, but everybody is caught up in another playing of the scene. That is, the little kid is finally, he's not retarded, he can talk, and thank God we won't have to put him in a home and go broke. But if you looked in his eyes, it was the kid has relived that point. That kid right now is reliving Michelangelo and the big old thing of, Jehovah coming over and flying through the clouds like that, and poor little Adam laying there and holding up his finger. And you see that Jehovah, the higher part of man's nervous system, lit up in that kid, and he is suddenly created. He is now a human, and you can see it in their eyes. Nobody ever knows that they're all excited and bopping around. He can talk. But something else, that kid goes, it's damn near a mystical experience. Except it's wasted on a kid almost as bad as it's wasted on most adults, so there you go. After the kid can think a while, after humanity had the mind for a while, consider the position. And I said I was going to do it back to the history of humanity as a whole, but you can still do it with you. You can still see it. It just happens so fast and you're so used to it is why I hesitate using just that, but you actually relive it. But think about humanity, that you'd been Adam and Eve, and there you were, let's say that you, whatever age you were, that then intellect got going. Up until then, everything was going quite well. It went as well for you, that is Adam and Eve, as it did for any lion or wolf. You ate, engaged in sex, you slept when you were tired, you got in and out of the rain as best you could, you tried to find a climate that was agreeable to you. And then here's this intellect. And sooner or later, the first thing you would have thought about the intellect was a mystery that what in the hell is this? And there was no one to talk to. So you got to do it that way is find the story of each person growing up, because now you've got adults around you. But think about the first man and woman. What in the hell is this? After the fact, also I might point out to you, it's not of any great importance, but all the creation stories, all of the early chapters of all religious literature always make up for that in some way. That in some way somebody, an external force, a supernatural force, had to tell man what was going on. They do not do it as directly as I did, that they speak to him about what his mind is. Not hardly. That's not the way they interpret it. But at any rate, there they are, and they've got a thing that cannot be satisfied in their old ways. They cannot eat it into submission. Sex will not turn it completely off. Sleep seems to turn it off. And then they wake up, and one of them goes, after some length of time, one of them goes, well, I was asleep last night. Yeah. It was almost like, yeah. You too? Yeah. It was like my mind, or this thing, it kept going. My eyes closed. I laid down. I didn't move. And yet it was like something went on. The other mystery, the second stage of the mystery, and we've got to move ahead, you figure it out, longer period of time. It could be generations, it could be minutes, it could be seconds. Once you understand, it does not matter. But if I was trying to make this in any way palatable to an ordinary group of sophisticated people, I would probably expand it into, or hint it was into thousands of years, because that's long enough that they can't really argue with it on the spot. They have to say, well, I have to think about it. And especially if you go back and you insinuate that man was actually doing more than what is considered now. If you started insinuating pre-Sumerian times, prehistorical times, and you started hinting that you knew something about it, and you then refer to like several thousand years, especially the intellectuals, they're so easy to do that too. They go, well, okay, go ahead. Because it could fit. I mean, my theory could be wrong, I could have made it up, but so far they can't deny it. There's enough room that even an intellectual can close his eye and kind of stumble around, and it could make sense. Here's the second level of the mystery. After some length of time, some way they had to turn to one another, or if it could have been one person, he thought to himself, here's the second mystery, which would have been even more distilled, or possible to be more distilled directly verbally. The mystery is this thing up here in my head now is telling me to do things that I would have never done before, and telling me to refrain from doing things that I would have always done before this son of a thing showed up. Mm-hmm. We'll now assume that there are more people than just Adam and Eve. This thing up here now, the mystery is that there's now a part of him that seems as of great significance. Look at a kid. Think about my history of humanity. It was very shortly that that became of greater significance, greater importance to people than, overall, than from here down. It did not diminish the enjoyment of sex or eating, and etc. But this thing goes on all the time, and your stomach is only hungry for a little while. You feed it, and it's gone. And even the brawniest of Greeks, how many times can you screw a day? Especially after Adam got to be over, 30 or 40 years old. So when you're in the mood for sex, you screw, and it's over with for a while. You're sleepy, you eat. You go to bed, and you... The point is, up until then, everything that was natural to a person could be satisfied. With no thought, no question, you were just satisfied, or else you died. This thing, not only, the original question was, what is it? Which was a little... I'll grant you, probably, even by my version, existentialist, ick for Adam. It very shortly got to as I said, a question that could be quite directly distilled in their mind is what's going on, because they are now faced with the first mystery, which nowadays psychology would call it a conflict, but it was a mystery, and it is still a mystery. People just do not call it that. And the mystery is this. Adam turns around, and he sees his neighbor's wife. And used to, he would have jumped her, especially if he could have whipped his neighbor's, her old man. Oh, he's hungry. And there's nothing there in the cave to eat, and he looks around, and the guy in the next cave left some food out. And up until then, they did like everybody else does. They did like God intended. If you're a bigger dog than the one next door, you went over there and you took it. Or maybe you tried to fake it. And now he has this thing that's telling him not to do things that he's always done. And I will even grant you that not necessarily was that directly, immediately. But he was now faced with a mystery that there was something in him that he would start to go do something. And something went, wait a minute. Something interfered. You think that's not a mystery? Think about a kid. Up until then, when you were a child, every time you had to go to the bathroom, you didn't have to worry about it. The universe is a bathroom. But then, pretty soon, this gets going, and suddenly, you've got other people telling you, no, no, no. Now, you don't remember it, but you think that's not unnatural? None of you that have dogs remember the first few times you tried to tell a dog, no, no, no? I won't go further what a dog thought about you before then, but by then he thought, Jesus, into the hands of what sort of deranged person or creature have I fallen? That you got to go. I mean, there's nothing more natural than have to go when you got to go. And somebody goes, no, 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 no. We will assume, or I will assume, that most of you assume that you are more intelligent than most humans are than dogs. We'll go ahead and operate on that assumption. So now think about Adam. And he had nobody outside of him telling him. I'm still not using Adam and Eve as like pre-civilization, the pre-collective mentaling of man. I like that. It sounds almost insulting. The collective mentaling of man. Feels like something, oh no, 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 oh no. Yeah, I'm sorry. You made the gods mad, and now, by God, you're going to be mentaled. No, bronze me. No, mentaled. But now consider, and this gets into a third stage of the mystery. We could stay on that one forever. That why? What is going on now? The things that he would naturally have done. Now you've got to remember, this is before any morality, we'll say, before any collective civilization. There's nowhere to blame it. You couldn't turn around and go, well, it's just the Puritan morality of my time that says I shouldn't have sex with people outside of marriage. There was nowhere. Nobody was telling him that. You think that wasn't a mystery? Suddenly, all the things that he would normally have done, eat a smaller man's food, take a smaller man's wife, take a smaller man's cave if it was drier, and that's the way it went. That was the way everything else operates. That's the way everything besides man still operates, in case you hadn't noticed. Nobody finds any fault with it. That's the way it operates. If it didn't operate that way, we would be here on this planet by our lonesome. And so here stands man. And the things he has always done, no thought, no question, he just did them. And they were natural. Now there is something going, wait a minute, wait a minute. No, 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 oh, no, no. Where did it come from? He's got no one to blame it on. He cannot blame it on his parents. Up until that point, he couldn't blame it on God. Well, God's just trying to interfere. Up until then, it's just him and this burgeoning little infantile intellect. You think that's not a mystery? Then beyond the history that I'm pushing back even further, at least in academic circles, ordinary people will pick up history to the point that man, the first stories in the Western, well, in the Eastern world too, the first ones sound like fairy tales. They're now considered to be myths and legends. Some of them were written down as history. And now, after the fact, historians cannot believe that people who were literate enough and intelligent enough to actually write down these stories 5,000 years ago actually believed that they were true. And so they call them myths and legends. But what were the first ones about, besides any I may know, but the ones that you can find in books? About the gods, about spirits, about supernatural forces. And nowadays, simple people love that, because to them that is proof obvious that immediately the gods, reveal themselves to man. That just shows the indigenous nature, the intrinsic nature of religion to man. That's a nice story. That if you're a drinker, we can also find they now have found traces in, by the way, the Sumerian culture. Some people have found some old records, recipes for beer, in case you hadn't read about it, and a couple of guys, some anthropologists, have now brewed beer from a recipe. So you understand it can make drinkers feel good. But you can go, wait a minute. Man discovered beer right after he discovered God. Rather than it being excuse moi and a rationale for the appearance of religion, try again to put yourself back to the point that there are these urges, and when I describe Adam and Eve back then, or Ken and Barbie, I'm attributing to them more or less the kind of consciousness and the kind of attitude you have. That is, there you are, if you can do this, been doing it in your diapers, throwing up when you wanted to, peeing in people's faces when they've been over the crib, taking your neighbor's wife, taking his cave when yours got cold, and suddenly, instead of a kid and having a voice outside going, don't do that, a man, Adam, begins to hear this kind of voice like, don't do that. I won't go into a whole routine. I was about to make up a comedy routine about, hey, who said that? And then Adam had to think, wait a minute, I hope nobody said that because I'm here alone. That would have been the first Louisiana haint tale. You know, what he would ask himself, what do I mean, who said that? There is nobody but me. But then the point is, he realized, wait a minute, my lips didn't move. I didn't say that. I was about to go after that new guy's wife, that little runt that showed up, that good-looking woman. I was about to jump her, and I was about to, and something said, no, don't do that. And he thought, who said that? And there's nobody but him. And he realized, I know when my lips move. I mean, I may be Adam and kind of, slow, but, I knew that wasn't me that said that. Where did it come from? That doesn't sound at all like God. Doesn't sound at all like subconscious mind. They could not believe. It was a mystery as to what is telling me not to do the things that heretofore have been natural. Now, a little closer to this. Let's assume that they all got, well, which they did, but they got through all of that. We're discounting the mystics who started popping up along the way. But humanity as a whole survived all of that, as witnessed by the fact that everyone's still here. But the next aspect of the mystery would have been, somewhere after the stages I've described, was a man began to ask himself, he's gotten used to the last stage I just named, that let us say that man collectively has become somewhat civilized, that there is now an accepted around the area where they're living. Up in the cliffs where these caves are, there's some semblance now of a civilization, that Adam and the other people around, other 200 or 300 people, and they're all experiencing the same thing, that something in them is telling them not to do things that heretofore they have done with no thought, to say the obvious, because they had no thought. But it was never in question. It was the way life was, and now there is something absolutely, absolutely new. To call it new is almost an insult. It's almost as though it came from some other world. The original flying saucers, little green men, except they couldn't find them because they were hidden. But now let's assume that we have a handful of people who've gotten together and they are all experiencing the same thing. And so after some length of time, they even would discuss it. But when Adam says to Sam, did you not new guy showed up, that little runny looking guy with that woman, I started to jump her and I couldn't do it. I mean, I could have done it, I guess, but it was like I started to and he looks at him like, am I going crazy? Am I about to become a hairdresser or something? And Sam went, the same thing that happened to me. So then they asked a few more. And it turns out that everybody there, all the men and all the women with their own version, but the men it's easier to describe because they're the pushy, aggressive, and messy ones. So it's easier to describe their evolution. In fact, you shouldn't laugh because women may not have evolved. They may have been born right, and it's only men. Women just kind of wait around and see how it's going to go. No, they don't have that much to overcome. But at any rate, so all the men, they talk about it, and so then it becomes the first sense of morality. That it gets to be, at least through habit, it becomes, for the people here in that one area, that they no longer, just because they can pick on a smaller guy, just because they can beat up one guy and take his wife, take his food, it is now no longer accepted. And I'm not to say that it all stopped, because it hadn't stopped today. But it became then the norm for that not to occur, that you did not, as a everyday affair, take that which was not yours, whether it be sex, food, shelter. That was the first sense of civilization, a collective going against that which was, survivally speaking, natural. Now, we're past that stage. Now, here was the next mystery I was going to bring up, like the fourth stage of it. Is now they're getting a little safer. Not only is Adam not attacking other people, you understand, it's always a two-way street in this great three-dimensional tango palace. But now Adam is safer, because he doesn't have to worry, because there's always somebody bigger than Adam going to show up, but now he doesn't have to worry that much. So then you've got the chance to let the mind do something a little bit more reflective, that now men can sit around, they're not so having to watch their backs all the time. So I'm going to suggest the next stage of a mystery is then men, once they begin to be somewhat reflective and consider the state of affairs, the next mystery would be, and remember all the ones we described. It starts off, I now cannot do the kinds of things that I used to do. Something's interfering. What is it? Then it got to be the point that it became the norm. Now they're living in a more civilized milieu, and now a man here and there sits around the fire and he reflects, why, now that this is the norm, now that we've just all assumed, where they wrote it down, but they've all agreed we will not pick on smaller people, we will not take that which is not ours, which is the basis of all of it. And he, by then, all reflective people would have considered it to be an improvement once they got accustomed to it. I cannot steal everybody's food and I can't take everybody's woman, but all things considered, it seemed to be a beneficial, a useful trade-off. So here sits one of our first philosophers after he reached this stage. And the next mystery is, all right, now I've accepted that. There's no doubt that it's better being this way. And by then, he's made up a name. He's calling it God. He's calling it a sense of morality. He's calling it conscience. He's calling it Zeus flying in the night and the spirits dwelling in his head. He has called it something by now. Let's call it a sense of conscience. Or God. You can call it anything you want to. But he has now, man has accepted the fact that they are better off following this. Because once you've got the right kind of balance, it did not cut down the enjoyment of food. It's just you just eat your food. It didn't cut down the enjoyment of sex. It's just you do not beat up somebody and take away their sexual partner. So it did not diminish what was going on originally. It was just now a different situation, a different game. And they, everything considered, man had to consider it a reasonable and beneficial trade-off. I say that for two reasons. One is, if you're simple-minded, I can say, well, look, we're still doing it. You go, that's true. I guess we're on to a good thing. The truth is, life made you do it. The first philosopher, though, sits around, and now he's accepted the collective norm of civilization, a sense of morality. Here's the next mystery. This is beginning to get real close to the beginning of mysticism. The next mystery is, now that I have accepted this, and now that to me there's no doubt that listening to the dictates of God, listening to the direction of this thing, is best. There's just no doubt. It's best. When to a large part of the time, I ignore it.
Yeah.
because everybody did not quit beating up smaller people. I told you that. Or, as some of the later philosophers, or some of the first mystics came along, some of them even had to figure it out. Even if you weren't beating up people that were smaller and taking their food, here sits the first philosopher. After some length of time, he's sitting around one night after a good meal, been laid, nice night, stars are out, and he's sitting there by himself. And his neighbor, the little short guy, goes by with that beautiful woman. And he's still thinking, you know, I could whip that man, I could beat him, he wouldn't even know what happened. I'd be on him like a rash. I could take her, God, she looks good. And he thinks, wait a minute. We have already assumed, there's no doubt, life is better. There's not even in question that life is so much better now that we quit doing that. They did not quit doing it individually, overtly even. You know that because crime still goes on, antisocial behavior goes on. So even back then, even though everybody in that cave, everybody up on that cliff, our first little civilization, even though they quit picking on the smaller guy and taking his food and women, you do know that Adam out, sometime he runs across that guy, and they're off by themselves. Half a day's walk away from where they are out hunting, and there that guy has caught something good to eat, and Adam's had no luck at all, and there's nobody even near, and he knows it's a half a day walk back. And back then, life was rough. You could fall off a cliff any time. Put the blackjack to him, put a rock to him, and take it, because who's going to be the wiser? Nobody even noticed. I mean, they just noticed he didn't come back, but nobody's going out and look for him. Back then, life was rough and short. I mean, the guy was probably 15 or 16 years old and was an old man anyway. And they thought, well, he just died of old age. All right, I know. Back to my first philosopher. Here's what you got, here's what it's getting at. And it's not men figuring this out. You've got to understand, again, to make it make sense in your lifetime, if it is doing good, it is the sprouting of life itself through man's nervous system. But here it is to the men, the way their mind is reflecting, the first philosopher, the first, as I said, men being able to sit down and use the mind for something other than social, civilizing purposes, to do something with it other than just suppress barbaric behavior, uncivilized behavior. This was the first time that men, in a real sense, began to think, to use the mind for something other than a governor, than a suppressor of antisocial behavior, so that man could collect and have time to think. So here says my first philosopher, and I can say this easy, I'm trying to, but I know it's tricky because people do not think about it this way. But the beginning of real mysticism, the beginning of the mystery schools, and the beginning of real religion, if there was such a thing surviving extant now, was the question, the mystery now, why, without any doubt, is this the right thing to follow, this thing up here? They could have been calling it the voice of God, the voice of creation, my conscience. They just know this has made all the difference in the world. This has changed all of our lives. There's no doubt. This is it. You can't even question it. Everybody knows that. That is the proof now of civilization. And you can complain all you want to if you're an ordinary person. You can say, well, I don't like some of the restrictions. I don't like the fact that we can't buy drugs on the street, or in some countries, I don't like the idea, or states, I can't buy liquor on Sunday. I don't like the fact that you can't have more than one wife. You can say all of that. But proof of being sane, being one of the ordinary, sane, stable people in life, is that you do not question the fact, even though you personally go, I wish I could just stay drunk all the time. I wish I could screw every woman I see. But you just accept, if you're sane, it doesn't mean that you sexually stop wanting to, let's say. Or you wish you could steal. You go in the store and you think, God, I wish I could just take things. Why do I have to spend my money on junk like this? I may not use it, but I want it. You know, who's looking? Why can't I just take it? And you can say to yourself, I could do it in a sense. But if you're sane, you do know this. Even though you individually go, yeah, but I still wish I could. But you still feel as though this is the right thing to follow. When you do not feel that way, that's when society in general, that is, when life's larger than the majority, they will separate you. They will hunt you down, they'll shoot you, they'll arrest you, they'll put you away under one guise or the other, because that is not acceptable. So here man sits. Let's go back to my early Adam. that he is now in the same position that all sane people are now. If you are sane and civilized, if you're sane, if you're genetically sound, no matter what you say, and everybody still says it, you can stand around with your buddies or anybody, and you'll talk about, God, I wish I could screw her. I wish I could just steal somebody's car. You can say all that. But if it comes down to it, you do not question humanity in general, the collective, sane majority of humanity. They do not question the fact that this is the proper thing to live by. They can be calling it conscience, God, their religion, anything they want to. But what they're doing is comparing living to something up here somewhere. They used to call it the heart, but somewhere up here other than down the genitals and the stomach. That I am not an animal. Sometimes I can eat like an animal, and I can sure sometimes screw like an animal, but we are not animals. And men do not question, sane people do not question the fact that even though they individually may have at some moment a complaint against morality and against going by this, it is not questioned that this is the proper thing to go by. It's not in question, period. If you find it in question, you're in for bad trouble. They're going to cull you out of the herd. You'll become, anyway, society will not stand for it. Life considers you genetically flawed. So, I'm finally going to try to put into words the next mystery. Here sits my man, our first philosopher, damn near verging on being a mystic. Of course, there were no books, and for him to go to a New Age bookshop then and try to figure out what it was. But anyway, one thing at a time. He's first got to become a philosopher. He sits there, and he thinks, all right, how is it? Life is now so much better. It's not in question. Listen to this thing. Not in question. But think about it. There had to be somebody, one time, the first guy who thought it, he went, wait a minute, if this is all so right, because now this is natural. Actually, they got over it being unnatural for this to try and suppress or to affect all of this down here, that now this is the natural state. Not only natural, it is the preferable state, that they're all thankful it happened. The natural state now is to listen to this thing as opposed to listening to down here. There's no longer a choice. Nothing wrong with down here, but you cannot go with just what it wants, when it wants it, and how it wants it. This has to take some control over it. So there he sits. I'm going to get it out sooner or later. And he thinks, all right, this is the natural state. We've progressed to this. It is so much better now. It's not even in question. But how come it's not completely in charge? Mm-hmm. Did I build it up so big that... Now remember, all right, let me tell you again, remember, all these people did not quit beating up on the small guy in the next cage. They did not quit trying to grab other people's women, grab other people's food. They did not stop it, and they certainly didn't stop it up here, that is, thinking about it. But the original question, this mystery, which I could say was the first mystery really worthy of the name, the first mystery was, all right, here we are now, we're humans, I've got this thing. The voice of God, the voice of creation. I've got a higher force in me that has made all the difference in the world. Our life is so much better. Now we're off and running. This is the thing to live by. There's no doubt about it. But if, for whatever reason, and most simple people, of course, have always attributed it to some supernatural, extra systemic force, something outside the human realm, that if the gods, these great forces, thought so highly of us, to give us this thing that just, there's no difference between the way we live and the way wolves live. And at their ages, some of them probably had grandparents, or if they were old enough, they can remember when they didn't live much better, that they were there fighting with the wolves over food and leftovers. But they look now and they go, what a gift we've got. But the mystery is, this is such a gift. We have been given this. Then why is the thing not in complete control? Maybe I should put it more in anecdotal, personal terms. It became everyone's unstated driving force in life to live by this. And to live by this, when I said even though it became natural, that the situation became natural, it still did not have complete control. That's what you got to remember. It doesn't in you now. And so the desire to be a better person arose from that. The men didn't plan it. This made them do it. But then once they had time to slow down and sit by a fire and begin the first reflecting, they thought, all right, here's this thing, and it tells me I'm just going to jump ahead and say they made up the words for it finally. It tells me that it's better for me not to listen down here. If there's a conflict between down here and up here, I should listen to this. And then they realize, just because that's now is obviously the preferable way to live, I do not always do it. The mystery is, I know I should do this. And don't get hung up now, even though I said that they were collected up to the point that they could have a sense of unwritten morality, that they were becoming civilized. Don't go back and try to attribute it to some external force, some civil force, or some secular, or some clerical force that they now blame it on priest or somebody. They accepted themselves, just as kids. Well, they accepted themselves that this is telling me the better way to operate. It's not. There's no question of that. I know that. Why do I not all the time do it? The stage that went from there into the beginning of this kind of activity, the real mystery activity, was why, how can it be, not why, how can it be that I want to do better and forget to do it? How come in the first mystic, of course, he narrowed it all down. You know, all this God and Spirit, what had they been talking about? Conscience. All he knew was, it's coming out of me. It's coming out, and I can feel it up here. It's coming out here, and it tells me things to do that would be better for me. It's not in question, and I know it. The mystery is, since this thing is now in me, and it's such a gift, why is I'll turn right around and forget to listen to it? That was the mystery. That was also, as I was mentioning to some of you, that was, in one quite real sense, that was the seeds laid for all ideas of evil. Because the mystery was such that the mind could not answer it. That is, how can it be? And we can jump up to today that people can say that they realize that the mind may not be the thing that produces awakening, but it is the thing that will keep you from ever finding it. That is, it operating the way in which it operates now. And that people for thousands of years have figured that out, at least that much. That they have figured out, whether they believe that they were trying to reach some higher state of consciousness, there's been people all over the planet that it came to their attention, that they kind of figured, they stumbled across themselves, that my mind, by and large, just rambles on, it just yaks and it goes on and on. And even though I may be an important person here in the village and among my fellow man, sometimes I just think, what in the hell is this thing doing? I can get through life, and every time I stop and think, well, what's this thing doing? It's almost as though there's been a kind of deliberation take over. There's almost a kind of control of which I had no awareness, and it's so fleeting, but it's almost as though time stopped. It's almost as though I am in touch. I can almost hear things going on, not voices, but I can almost hear life breathing. It is just an extraordinary state. I can do it right this second. Why can't I remember that? What is my mind doing? What is the ultimate purpose of the mind? Now, ordinary people, as far as it ever got, as far as it is still gotten, is about the level of contemporary psychological paradigms, models, still religion, that and they still want to talk about the spirit and religion, of course, and psychology and psychiatry will speak of the mind having no real interest in it. Not the same way that the mystery schools did. They simply accept the fact that the mind runs on and it can do you greater harm or it can do you lesser harm. It's better if the mind has some structure to it that's full of information. You're better to be educated than not educated. But men abandon, and I'm not inferring they should have done otherwise, but men gave up any direct interest in consciousness. And that's true today. People, I'm sure if I had an ordinary audience, I could get people immediately to turn their head and say that's not true, and that's an absolute fact. Nobody has ever been interested in consciousness since Adam, speaking allegorically, than the mystery schools. That's why they sprang up. Nobody's interested, well, in consciousness, I don't mean to hide it behind a multi-syllable word. Nobody's really interested in the human mind. You would say psychology, they're not interested in the human mind. You might say neurosurgery. No. Psychology is not interested in the working of the human mind. They're interested in the sickness of the mind. They got no choice. Religion has no interest in the mind. There's no academic subject. Psychologists have been the one that took care of that. If you thought they are interested in the mind, no, they're not. I'm not arguing with them, but you should be able to see that. They're not interested in the human mind. They're interested in the ills. They're interested in the flaws of the human mind. But if you tried to find a psychiatrist or a psychologist and ask them, what course can I take that explains the way the mind works? They'd look at you like a Jew that walked into a Muslim mosque and asked for a pork chop sandwich. They look at you. You said, what? You said, you're a psychologist. Yes, I'm the head of the department. Well, which course? I want to take a course over here. I'm not major, but I want to take a course. Which is the basic course that describes the way the human mind works? Go try it. Well, of course, obviously you hear it. But they would look at you like, and they'd have to narrow it down. They go, well, what are you interested in? The statistics of this and that? You would know. I want to know how it works. Oh, you might want to probably take maybe primate behavior 101. No. All right, human behavior 202. No, not behavior. I want to know how the mind works. And if you really pushed it, he would, well, go try it. You ought to be able to do it. People just do not normally think about there is nothing in life. There never has been. Philosophy played around with it, but philosophy there's not truly interested in how the mind works. They're interested in how word works. Words work. Nothing took up the study of the human mind. As you know, I normally call it consciousness to differentiate it from just the ordinary workings of everyday consciousness. But no one undertook the study of the human mind. No one. Since I got to that point, maybe we should hesitate here for a second and think about it. Find out where I'm wrong as usual. Find an exception. I mean, there's got to be somebody. Sociology, maybe. Right. The behavior of crowds, large groups of people. There is no interest. Life does not produce, there is, no matter how you think, psychology is it in our day and time, and you should see it. They simply are not concerned with how the human mind operates. There's a good reason for it. But then after my last stage of the mystery of like the foundations of the first mystery schools, the foundation of the first ideas of some great secret work and some group of people off somewhere doing something real weird, and that they should be watched. They're probably strange and weirdos. It was Adam and a few people. Could have been Adam, for all you know, for a long time. But at any rate, at best, he finally, after maybe several other generations or several hundred, a couple of guys got together, ended up over at a Waffle House over in Ethiopia, Persia, and they got to talking, and they realized that they were both interested in the same kinds of things, and they'd never met anybody else who was interested in it. And they couldn't even be real specific because there was no background for it. Life still does not provide any real basis for it, except now you've got the apparent window dressing of it, that you've got books about it, and you've got groups of people saying they're doing it. But still, life does not provide direct information in the same way as I just pointed out to you that there is no common interest or study of the human mind, including psychology, or, according to how sharp you are, especially psychology. Oh, no. Try and ask them how the human, nobody is interested. Well, that'd be their explanation. Well, maybe some other time we get in that, you can figure it out why. But the beginning of all this sort of activity was that they realized that nothing was being done, that there was no collective interest in how this thing worked. Up until that time, they might not have been even calling it the mind. They could be calling it God. See, the more divergent things, the things that sound further and further away from what a human is, if for no other reason, it gives you ordinary people more and more an opportunity to ignore the possibility. If you think that all this, that the best part of man, that what makes man is the voice of God speaking through him, then with ordinary people, you've got the immediate explanation as to why it's futile, if not blasphemous, to try to figure it out. Well, hey, you can't figure out God. psychiatry now would say, or neurology would say, well, hey, all we can do is take apart the brain piece by piece. I mean, if we dismantle it too much physiologically, who knows how it works? Yeah. Psychology go, well, what are we going to say? You ask me how the human mind works. Which one? You talking about the conscious mind? You talking about the subconscious mind? Yeah. Everybody gives up. The mystery. Once the mystery school started, they had a mystery. It's like, what took us so long? This is Adam, this other guy, one or two of them. Their mystery is, what took us so long to get around to this? Well, they had a bunch of new mysteries. They looked around at people they used to know, and they went, another mystery is, how come there's only two of us in the whole damn side of the planet interested in this? How come nobody else thinks about this? That's a mystery. Of course, all kinds of mysteries after that they would have had, like, well, what are we going to do now? You know, have you gotten any further with it than me? But then it takes on a new level of mystery, because after the first couple of them got together, they had to realize, they started passing around stories about what they've been trying to do with their mind. It would have been easy to give you a quick history of that they not only, both of them will assume, well, they were sane and civil, decent people at the time. They did not break the law, or they didn't get caught at it. They were just ordinary people. And amongst themselves, though, they came up on the conversation finally about, do you notice that even though you probably don't rape people anymore, do you? No. But have you noticed it in your mind? A lot of times you still think about it, either seeing somebody or just for no reason. You look off at a beautiful sunset and think, God, I'm horny. And the guy goes, yeah. They think, is that a mystery or not? Mm-hmm. Then the next mystery amongst them would have been, well, I started to say it, they began to trade stories, and one way or the other, one of them would say, I have noticed beyond the mind beyond this thing trying to affect everything else, and I can live with it, but I noticed that he'd probably ask the other person, have you noticed? Because nobody wanted to be the first person to try and say, God, I sure do wish I was more conscious, because even this one guy he had found, he could have lost his only friend, his only intellectual friend. So anyway, back to my made-up dialogue, and had to say, do you ever get the feeling, even though you know it's best to live by this, did you ever get the feeling that the majority of what that thing's doing is absolutely without any significance? I don't know why it keeps going on. Because everything it does right now, it's done before. Everything it tells me to do, I know to do. Everything it tells me to do, it's told me before. Every past event that repeats, it's something that's repeated God knows how many times. I lost count. I don't even know what numbers are anyway, but I've lost count. So the majority of what it's doing, he might ask the other guy, Adam asked Sam, have you noticed, is it true in you, that as great as this thing is, I don't have real figures, but would you say that about maybe 99%, at least the part you catch, is just noise? I mean, it has no significance to your life that you can tell. And he goes, yeah. And they ordered another cup of coffee. And he said, well, have you noticed this? If you can remember that and try to just dwell on it, kind of hold that and you think about it, the noise stops. And that guy goes, God damn, you're right. I knew it was weird. I never thought about it because I never talked about it, but that's exactly it. They'd both, I would suggest, I'm going to have to speed up the process of how mysticism started, but by then, one of them would have understood, this is long before chanting Om and meditating, that they began to understand there's a kind of deliberation and interference with the way the flow goes, and the easy way is just always slow things down. That's the trick that always works under all conditions, all cultures, all religions. Doesn't matter whether you're trying to remember the name of God, the member of Jehovah, no matter what you're doing, counting breaths, counting the number of heartbeats, no matter what it is, you'll forget them. But there's one thing you always remember, whatever it is, slow down. There's no question after that about how slower. So Adam asked Sam, well, have you noticed when you're aware of that, of how it just goes on, that it stops, yeah? And by then they would both look at each other like, you know damn well we're close to something. But what is it? They can't ask anybody else. They'd already given that up. But you are strapped to ask yourself what it is, the first person. All they know is it's like they've stopped. They're still conscious. They're humans. They have not turned back into raging beasts. But in a sense, they have become naturally unnatural again. Because the natural thing now is that this is in charge. This is the thing to listen to, other than several things with the first mystics. Other than, it's told me all good stuff. Remember, one of the first mysteries is it tells me all this good stuff, and I know it, but how come I don't listen all the time? So I didn't dwell on that much, but that's at the heart of all civilization. And that's at the heart, that's when man really began to be reflective, is to ask a man's self. Because he had nobody else to ask. By then they had collectively adopted behavior run by this, dictated by this. And so there's nothing else to ask. It would have been like you questioning the morality of the time. But it was an individual here and there began to ask, why individually I know this is better and everybody else agrees it is. All my friends, all my family, it is now the norm. If it is so great, why is it that I cannot always live by it individually? Why is it not totally in charge? Why is it not like discovering the secret way to live? How could a man discover it and then go, well, this is the way to live, but sometimes I won't do it. And that's not how it is. That's not the way the mind sees it. The way the mind sees it, the way it should have seen it, is I forget. That will not work anymore. You can't get religion to agree to that. You can't get a psychiatry, psychology to agree to it. But I've tried to point out to you, if you had a better memory, if your desire in life was to be a Christian, you could be a Christian. Never mind what the church says. Never mind what the Pope says, even he's not one. If his memory was better, he could be a Christian. You could be a Jew. You could be a Muslim. Because the whole thing is your mind's out of control. The mind is what came up with the ideas that fostered religion, and to say, well, you should not treat your fellow man any different than you would yourself. The man goes, yes, that's true. And when you do it, and you ask yourself, or somebody says, why'd you do that? You know better. You just go, I know better. Well, why'd you do it? And simple-minded, ordinary people many times say, well, the Satan made me do it. No, it didn't. It's quite simple. It's so simple, nobody's going to deal with it. It's the same way as, why did they not undertake the study of the mind to begin with? The question is, if you say it's your desire to be a Christian, to be a moose, to be an upstanding member of the AMVETS, to be a Shriner, whatever it is, and it's something that you can be, that they can describe and say, all right, if you do this, you are a Muslim. You go, okay. And suddenly you don't do it. They go, well, you told me you were going to be a Muslim. They won't say this. It slipped my mind. Mm-hmm. That would have been right at the cusp of where mysticism started, as my cavemen sitting around, and they realized I should be listening to this. It's not in doubt. I can hear it. What is it that keeps me from living absolutely by that? And after that, ordinary people, once that kind of thinking began to seep into the population in general, that gave birth to philosophy and religion. But a man who was sharp enough to be my kind of first philosopher and potential first mystic, he realized quite simply what it was. My mind tells me to do things, and I have no doubt that this is the thing I should be listening to right now, under all ordinary conditions, all my behavior. Sometimes I don't. And I ask myself, why? I forgot. Mm-hmm. What kind of basis is that for some sort of religion or some kind of great mystery school? I forgot. Yeah. Why have you fallen into such a terrible position in life? How has your life fallen apart? No. How were you at one time committed to certain high ideals, and now look at you? What happened? I forgot. But it's obvious that you're in need of clinical, immediate psychiatric emergency help. Yeah. Because it's something very deep-rooted for a man to lay there, for a man to run amok as severely as you have, and your explanation is you forgot. Yeah. God knows what's happened to you. What terrible I mean, we're talking about probably the rest of your life in analysis, just to figure out why you would be into such denial that you would just say, well, I forgot. And that's all it was. Their first form of mysticism was that they understood if it was not for forgetting, then the first mysteries that we had about why is it that I do not listen to this all the time? Why is it that no one has any interest in what the mind is? It's because everyone forgot. There's a cure for forgetting. At least I'll leave it on the bad note. It's a shame we didn't have time because a cure for forgetting. I was going to start writing a book, but Jesus, we're talking hundreds of thousands of pages. That's one reason I put it off. To tell you the truth, what I'm working on first, I need something. I promised some people of more practical immediate is I'm writing a book. It's now up to like this about how to stop drinking. But once I get that through, then I'll get into how to stop forgetting. Does the word deliberation at all come to mind?